Imagine two wealthy landlords getting into a violent physical fight. But instead of just throwing punches at each other, they force the workers on their distant farms, thousands of miles away, to fight to the death. That is exactly what happened to East Africa during the World Wars. To understand why, look at the map in 1914. Britain controlled Uganda and Kenya. Germany controlled Tanganyika. When Britain declared war on Germany, these colonies were automatically pulled into the crossfire. Tied to Europe, they were yanked directly onto the battlefield. The people living in these territories had no original quarrel with one another, yet because they were subjects of warring empires, millions of East Africans were forced to take up arms, carry supplies, and risk their lives for a conflict they didn't start. World War I in East Africa took the form of a massive guerrilla campaign that ranged across thousands of miles of bush. German commanders like General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, Sr., led British troops on a brutal chase that devastated local villages and farms. Because the East African bush had virtually no roads or motorized vehicles, the armies needed human power. Over 1 million East African men were conscripted into what the British called the Carrier Corps. In local languages, this was often pronounced as Carrier Corps. These men were forced to carry heavy loads of ammunition, food, and supplies on their heads for hundreds of miles. This chart shows the true toll of the conflict. Combat only accounted for a fraction of the casualties. The vast majority of East Africans who died in World War I were killed by exhaustion, starvation, and diseases like malaria. For the people on the ground, the First World War was entirely about surviving forced labor and physical devastation in an incredibly lethal environment. 21 years later, the world went to war again. But in World War II, the dynamics for East Africa shifted. The Axis enemies were now Italy and Japan, and the battlefields moved away from the local bush to foreign territories, like the Horn of Africa and the dense jungles of Burma. This time, Britain was desperate for frontline combat power. They expanded a multi-battalion regiment known as the King's African Rifles. Instead of acting mostly as porters, Ugandans, Kenyans, and Tanzanians were trained, armed, and deployed as combat soldiers. The regiment's structure shaped an entire generation. Many future East African leaders gained critical military and organizational experience through the colonial armed forces. They absorbed a strict veteran culture that heavily influenced the region's post-colonial governments. The most critical change happened in the minds of the soldiers. In the jungles of Burma, African soldiers watched white men panic, bleed, and die. They returned home knowing that their masters were just ordinary humans, effectively ending the belief that Europeans were naturally superior beings. Think about that realization for a moment. What happens when thousands of skilled, battle-hardened veterans return home to Uganda, knowing they are fully equal to their colonizers, only to be treated as subjects again? The colonial government had promised these ex-servicemen good jobs and pensions. Instead, they returned to collapsed local economies and severe poverty. That betrayal took their newfound confidence and ignited it into organized nationalist anger. These returning soldiers came back equipped with practical tools. They could drive trucks, operate radios, speak English, and handle modern weapons. By fighting alongside Indian soldiers who were already demanding their own independence, East Africans learned how to organize mass political movements. Looking at this matrix, we can see the exact difference between the two conflicts. World War I relied on the Carrier Corps, resulting in massive casualties from disease, and a simple transfer of Tanganyika from Germany to Britain. World War II utilized the King's African Rifles in foreign combat, which directly resulted in a unified demand for freedom. The independence movement rested firmly on 4 structural pillars, built during World War II: the shattered myth of European superiority, the acquisition of new technical skills, exposure to global democratic ideas, and the post-war economic frustration of the veterans. The World Wars brought unimaginable suffering to East Africa, but by pulling colonial subjects into a global conflict, the empires inadvertently armed them. They provided the practical skills and the direct evidence of European vulnerability needed to dismantle the colonial system.